3 days before my official retirement date, I walked into a conference room decorated for my celebration. A gold banner stretched across the wall. Congratulations! Calla, 30 years. On the table sat a crystal plaque engraved with my name, a sheet cake with a bright red 30, and the transition binder I had written 18 months earlier. But the seating arrangement told the truth. My chair had been moved to the side. Audrey Vale, the CEO's daughter, was standing front and center. And that was the moment I understood this wasn't a goodbye. It was a quiet erasure, right now. I'm curious to know where you're hearing this from. What's the temperature where you live? I read all the comments, and if this story resonates with you, consider subscribing. Sometimes, the smallest click conveys the biggest message. I am Calla Price, 61, Chief Fiduciary Officer, for 3 decades. My signature carried legal responsibility for that fund. I rebuilt it after the 2008 collapse. I structured the escrow protections. I negotiated custodial safeguards with Northern Atlantic Trust so no executive could unilaterally override fiduciary governance. Marcus Vale never cared about that. He always considered me a thorn in his side. Then he walked to the podium, smiling like this was generosity. Calla's earned her rest. He began. And it's time we modernize. Then he announced that, effective immediately, full fiduciary authority would transfer to his daughter, Audrey Vale, not after my retirement, not after a trustee vote, not after custodian approval, now. Fresh leadership, Marcus added lightly. Faster decisions. There had been no trustee resolution, no compliance filing, no notice to Northern Atlantic Trust. Governance, apparently, was optional when your last name matched the CEO's. The applause was thin. Audrey stood beside him, polished, composed, and did not meet my eyes. I held the plaque in my hands, feeling the weight of 30 years reduced to beveled glass. I asked, evenly, has Northern Atlantic Trust approved the transfer? Marcus flicked his wrist. It's internal. Internal. The room went quiet. Shock doesn't shout. It settles. It waits. That night, at 11:40 p.m., I opened my laptop and sent one email. Subject line, fiduciary, continuity clarification. From that point on, this story is no longer simply a workplace tale. What follows is a blend of dramatic elements and AI-powered storytelling designed to highlight the emotional truth and profound humanistic message hidden within. Hopefully, you'll find something for yourself. The erasure began before my retirement paperwork was even processed. By 8 the next morning, my system access had been temporarily restricted. That was the phrase I teased. My credentials still worked for email, but the pension fund dashboard, the one I had monitored for 15 years, no longer displayed my name as fiduciary authority. Audrey's did. Effective immediately. Marcus passed my office with the efficiency of a man reorganizing furniture. Transition requires decisiveness, he said, as if governance were a branding exercise. I nodded. I had seen decisiveness before. In 2011, when the market dipped and projections showed a potential $47 million shortfall, I restructured the allocation model overnight. In 2015, after an internal compliance scare, I designed the escrow protection layer that insulated the fund from unilateral executive withdrawals. Marcus had signed the approval memo himself. I still had the copy. Now he behaved as if history were optional. By mid-morning, Audrey's inbox began filling with messages from Northern Atlantic Trust. They were polite but precise. Requests for ERISA compliance certification, a board trustee resolution confirming transfer of authority, formal transition documentation. She didn't have them. I watched her expression change as each email arrived. Professional calm, then calculation. Marcus stepped in. We'll handle it quietly, he told her. Quietly, that word again. But banks do not operate on quiet assurances. They operate on documentation. At 11:17, an automated notification appeared on the executive distribution list. Northern Atlantic Trust was reviewing fiduciary authorization status due to an unverified change in oversight. No accusations, no drama, just review. And in fiduciary language, review is the sound a freeze makes before it happens. By the time the word review circulated through the executive inbox, I had already decided what I would do and what I would not do. I was not going to argue. I was not going to threaten. And I was certainly not going to sabotage the fund I had protected for 30 years. Instead, I followed the law. At 12:06 a.m., I drafted a formal document titled Notice of Potential Fiduciary Disruption Risk. It was not dramatic. It cited Clause 14 of the custodial agreement with Northern Atlantic Trust, the provision requiring immediate disclosure if fiduciary authority changes without documented trustee approval or compliance verification. The notice did not accuse Marcus of wrongdoing. It did not question Audrey's intentions. It simply stated the facts. An unverified transfer of fiduciary control had occurred prior to formal retirement, without board resolution or custodian acknowledgement, under federal pension oversight standards. That triggered review. This was not retaliation. It was obligation, once submitted. The bank had 24 hours to assess risk exposure. During that window, they were required to evaluate whether protective measures were necessary to safeguard beneficiary assets. That evaluation was automatic, impersonal, clinical. At 2:20 a.m., my phone rang. Marcus did not bother with pleasantries. "Reverse it," he said. "I can't reverse compliance," I replied. "You're creating panic." "No," I answered evenly. "Documentation did." Silence hung between us, heavy and unproductive. He ended the call without another word. The following morning, Northern Atlantic responded. Their language was measured, pending completion of fiduciary verification and trustee confirmation. They were initiating a provisional safeguard protocol, effective immediately. Any disbursement exceeding $5 million required enhanced review and dual authorization from certified fiduciary officers. It wasn't a freeze, not yet, but it was friction. And friction in financial systems spreads faster than accusation. By mid-morning, Treasury operations were stalled on 2 scheduled transfers. Questions began circulating among senior staff. Compliance requested clarification. Legal requested documentation. I did not celebrate. I did not react. I simply organized my files. Cold control isn't loud. It doesn't demand. It doesn't flinch. It waits for the system to do what it was designed to do. And now, the system was awake. By sunrise, the review had teeth. At 6:30 a.m., my phone vibrated with the notification I had expected, but still felt in my chest. Northern Atlantic Trust had shifted the pension escrow into protective hold status. The language was precise temporary safeguard pending verification of fiduciary continuity. It wasn't a seizure. It wasn't a sanction. It was protection. Protection meant paralysis. Within minutes, Treasury flagged an error on a scheduled $8 million allocation transfer. The revolving credit facility tied to the fund's liquidity buffer was automatically suspended. Without verified fiduciary authorization, the bank would not extend exposure. $120 million sat intact and untouchable. By 6:45, Marcus was in the executive corridor shouting into his phone. Who froze the money, he demanded. He didn't ask if it was frozen. He already knew. The response from Northern Atlantic was delivered through speakerphone in the board office. Calm and unhurried. Risk mitigation protocol, the senior vice president explained. An unverified change in fiduciary authority requires temporary protective measures under custodial agreement, Clause 14. Clause 14. The one Marcus had signed in 2015 after I insisted on escrow insulation safeguards. This is an internal personnel matter, Marcus snapped. With respect, the banker replied. Custodial risk is never internal. That was the moment Audrey stopped standing behind him and started listening. Her posture changed first, then her expression. She had spent the last 24 hours believing this was optics, a tense but manageable transition. Now she understood liquidity exposure, reputational spillover, and regulatory reporting thresholds were involved. Pension funds are not branding exercises. They are federally scrutinized fiduciary structures. By 7:15, two external vendors had called, asking why scheduled disbursements were delayed. Compliance began drafting an internal risk memo. Legal requested all transition documentation in writing. Marcus turned to me. "You did this." "Number one," I said evenly. "The contract did. Financial shock doesn't explode. It spreads. Credit tightens, calls multiply, silence becomes calculation." At 8:10, Northern Atlantic issued a formal notice due to the pending review. They were requesting an emergency hearing with the Board of Trustees to confirm fiduciary authority and governance compliance before restoring full access. Not optional, required. What had been framed as modernization was now a matter of documented oversight, and the sun was barely up. If you think a conversation between me and the CEO's daughter is coming, drop a 2 in the comments. Your voice shapes where this story goes next more than you realize. The knock on my office door came just after the emergency hearing notice circulated. Audrey stepped inside alone, for the first time since the announcement. She wasn't standing beside her father. She closed the door carefully, as if volume itself could trigger another compliance alert. The tension in the building had shifted from outrage to calculation, and she felt it. "I need to understand something," she said. I gestured to the chair across from me. I didn't offer reassurance. She exhaled slowly. "I haven't completed trustee certification. I finished the executive leadership program, but the ERISA fiduciary module is still pending. Legal said it could be finalized in a few weeks. A few weeks. The fund had been transferred in minutes. Marcus told me it wasn't an issue." She continued. "He said the board would ratify everything retroactively. Retroactive governance. The corporate equivalent of signing a check after it bounces." I didn't interrupt. She needed to hear her own words. "He wants me to sign a statement confirming I meet fiduciary requirements," she said quietly, "just to satisfy the bank." There it was. The shortcut. I folded my hands on the desk. My voice stayed even. "If you sign falsely, liability follows you, not him." Silence settled between us. Under federal pension law, a fiduciary misrepresentation is not a paperwork error. It is personal exposure, civil penalties, potential federal review. No executive shield protects an individual who knowingly signs inaccurate certification. Audrey's composure wavered for the first time. Not panic awareness. "He said it's procedural." She whispered, "Procedures exist for a reason." I replied, "I didn't persuade her. I didn't ask her to reconsider the role. I simply laid out the structure she had inherited and the weight attached to it." She stood after a long moment, straightened her jacket, and nodded once. Not to me. To herself. That afternoon, legal circulated the draft certification for her signature. It came back unsigned instead. Audrey sent a brief email to the board counsel requesting clarification on fiduciary qualification requirements before accepting authority. It was not dramatic. It was not defiant. But it was refusal. And in a governance crisis, refusal changes the balance of power. By the time the board convened, the temperature in the building had shifted from shock to scrutiny. The emergency session began at 10:15 a.m. sharp. Trustees filled the long walnut table, legal counsel on one side, compliance on the other. Northern Atlantic joined by secure conference line. The atmosphere was not hostile, it was clinical. The bank representative spoke first. "Under Custodial Agreement, Clause 14, he explained evenly, "an unverified change in fiduciary authority constitutes material risk exposure. If governance procedures are bypassed, personal liability may attach to the executive authorizing the transfer." Personal liability. The phrase landed with more weight than any accusation. Marcus leaned forward immediately. "This was a strategic transition," he said. Calla engineered panic by escalating a routine personnel decision. I didn't react. Emotional defense would only validate his framing. When the chair turned to me, I opened a folder I had prepared the night before. I submitted a notice of potential fiduciary disruption risk at 12:06 a.m. I said. The notice cited Clause 14, signed by Mr. Vale in 2015, requiring immediate disclosure if fiduciary authority changes without trustee resolution or custodian acknowledgement. I slid copies across the table. In 2011, after the projected $47 million shortfall, the board mandated escrow insulation safeguards. In 2015, those safeguards were formalized to prevent unilateral executive control. Yesterday's transfer did not include trustee ratification, ERISA compliance certification, or documented custodian approval. No adjectives, no accusations, just sequence. The bank confirmed. Our actions were procedural. No funds have been removed. Protective measures remain provisional, pending governance clarification. Marcus's jaw tightened. You're implying misconduct, he said. I'm describing process, I replied. Controlled exposure is not about confrontation. It is about visibility. Once documentation enters the record, narrative loses power. Legal counsel requested the exact timestamp of the internal transfer order. Compliance asked whether board members had been notified in advance. Silence followed each answer. Then, unexpectedly, Audrey cleared her throat. I'd like to speak, she said. Every head in the room turned toward her, and for the first time that morning, Marcus did not speak first. The silence after Audrey asked to speak felt heavier than the bank's warning. She didn't rush. She didn't look at me. She looked at the trustees, the people whose signatures actually carried governance weight. The appointment violated governance protocol, she said. Steady but unmistakably firm. No dramatics. No apology, she continued. I have not completed trustee certification. There was no formal board resolution authorizing immediate fiduciary transfer. Until that process is properly executed, I cannot accept the role. The words hung in the room like a document stamped and filed. Marcus turned toward her, disbelief flashing into anger. You're undermining me, he snapped. I'm protecting the employees, she replied. Not protecting the brand, not protecting the optics, the employees. It was a subtle but devastating distinction. She explained that she had reviewed the custodial agreement that morning. Clause 14 required formal acknowledgement by Northern Atlantic before fiduciary authority could legally shift. Without that acknowledgement, any certification she signed would expose her personally. I won't sign something inaccurate, she said. Courage in a boardroom rarely looks heroic. It looks procedural. It sounds like measured sentences that cannot be retracted. Marcus leaned forward, voice tightening. This is an internal matter. The board can ratify retroactively. Legal counsel cleared his throat. Retroactive ratification does not eliminate interim liability exposure. That was the pivot. Audrey didn't attack her father. She didn't accuse him. She simply stepped out of alignment with him. I'm requesting the board initiate proper transition review, she said. Until then, I decline fiduciary authority. Decline. The word shifted gravity. One trustee adjusted her glasses and addressed the chair. Given the custodial risk exposure and the sequence of events, I move that we consider a vote of confidence regarding executive governance oversight. Marcus froze. He hadn't expected resistance from her. He certainly hadn't expected it to trigger formal board procedure. The room no longer felt like damage control. It felt like accountability, and for the first time since the banner went up, I realized this wasn't about retirement anymore. It was about who would be allowed to define responsibility going forward. Marcus did not accept exposure quietly. By late afternoon, I received a formal notice from outside counsel alleging interference with executive authority and warning of potential legal action. The letter was aggressive in tone, carefully vague in substance. It suggested that my disclosure to Northern Atlantic had destabilized operations and damaged corporate confidence. Retaliation dressed in legal stationery. An hour later, I was asked to attend a meeting with Marcus and his attorney. I agreed. Documentation favors the present. The attorney opened a leather folder and spoke with rehearsed precision. Our position is that Ms. Price exceeded her advisory role during a transitional phase. I let him finish. Then he requested a copy of the custodial agreement. I slid it across the table. Clause 14 is not subtle. It requires immediate written disclosure to the custodian bank if fiduciary authority changes without documented trustee resolution. It uses the word shall, not may. It assigns responsibility to the acting fiduciary officer at the time of disruption. The attorney read in silence. Marcus shifted in his chair. This was a leadership decision. It was a fiduciary transfer, I said evenly. After several minutes, the attorney closed the document. Under the agreement, he acknowledged, Ms. Price had a legal obligation to notify the custodian of a potential disruption in fiduciary continuity. Not discretion, obligation. Marcus's jaw tightened. So you're saying she had no choice? I'm saying failure to notify could have constituted breach of duty. Retaliation loses momentum when the contract contradicts it. The meeting ended without further threats. But desperation has layers. Later that evening, compliance circulated a preliminary internal review summary. In reconstructing the timeline, auditors identified 2 prior instances within the past 18 months in which executive decisions had bypassed formal governance review procedures. Both were approved by Marcus under expedited authority. Neither had involved fiduciary control, but both demonstrated pattern. What had begun as a personal dispute was evolving into procedural scrutiny. Marcus had intended to frame this as interference. Instead, documentation was framing something else, and once patterns enter the record, they do not disappear quietly. By late afternoon, accountability had a schedule. The board reconvened at 4:40 p.m. No celebration banners this time, no applause, just trustees, counsel, compliance officers, and a silent line to Northern Atlantic waiting for confirmation of governance resolution. The chair opened with procedural language. This session concerns executive oversight and fiduciary compliance. Marcus sat rigid at the end of the table. Not defiant now, calculating. Legal summarized the findings: unverified fiduciary transfer, bypassed trustee resolution, and documented patterns of expedited governance overrides. The custodian's protective hold remained active pending formal board action. Then came the motion. A vote of confidence regarding Marcus Vail's executive stewardship and compliance integrity. Justice in corporate America is rarely dramatic. It is counted. Ballots were submitted electronically. No speeches, no theatrics. The results appeared on the screen moments later. 7-2. The chair cleared his throat. Effective immediately. Mr. Vail will step down as Chief Executive Officer, pending independent investigation. Marcus did not argue. He didn't look at me. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked out without acknowledging the room he had controlled for 12 years. Northern Atlantic remained on the line. Upon receipt of certified trustee resolution and reinstatement of verified fiduciary authority, the bank representative stated, protective measures will be lifted. Within an hour, formal documentation was executed. Interim fiduciary oversight reverted under board supervision. Compliance transmitted certified copies to the custodian. At 6:12 p.m. confirmation arrived. The escrow hold shifted from protective status to active governance compliance. The $120 million fund was fully accessible again, not because someone overpowered the system, but because the system had been restored. Relief did not feel triumphant. It felt stable. As trustees gathered their files, Audrey approached me quietly. I'd like to request something, she said. I waited. For the remaining 72 hours before your retirement becomes official, would you agree to serve as transition advisor properly, under documented review, not as a favor, as structure? Justice is not revenge. It is correction, and for the first time since the banner went up. The correction was deliberate. I nodded once. 72 hours. I said, by the book. This time, governance would not be decorative. 3 days later, I left exactly as scheduled. No speeches, No security escort, no scorched earth. I handed in my badge, cleared my desk, and signed the final compliance memo confirming restored fiduciary authority under proper governance procedure. The $120 million fund remained intact. 4,200 employees' retirements were secure. That was always the point. Audrey had already enrolled in formal fiduciary certification and scheduled independent oversight training. This time, documentation came before title. Marcus, meanwhile, faced an external investigation into governance breaches authorized under his tenure. Accountability had a paper trail now. I walked out without looking back. They thought retirement meant I was finished. It meant I was accountable to something bigger than them. What mattered most in the end wasn't the board vote or the title on the door. It was the quiet decision to honor the responsibility attached to my name. I learned that systems don't protect people, people protect systems. And when pressure comes, you find out whether you were guarding a paycheck or a principle. I didn't fight to keep a role. I acted to protect 4,200 futures that depended on steady hands. That's the difference between ego and duty. If you were placed in that position, replaced publicly, pressured privately, what would guide you? Fear, loyalty, or the long-term impact of your signature? These are not dramatic questions. They're everyday ones, just usually asked in smaller rooms. I'm curious, where are you listening from right now if this story meant something to you? Consider subscribing, liking, or sharing it, not because I need applause, but because every action helps these conversations travel further. Your engagement might reach someone wrestling with a decision about integrity today. Sometimes the simplest support, a comment, a share, a subscription helps accountability feel less lonely. And that matters more than you think. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.